In the evening, inside a supermarket near one of the shelves, a young man was engaged in a phone conversation with his wife. She seemed irritated, and the guy was making efforts to justify himself. He explained that he hadn't intentionally almost bought the wrong product, and that his purchase of a PlayStation had nothing to do with their ability to relax in Laketown. He insisted that they wouldn't have been able to enjoy themselves, even with the money he spent. At the checkout, there were 3 people waiting in line. The first person in line appeared a bit homeless. When the cashier announced the total, it turned out that the man was short of 10 rubles. He tried to persuade the cashier, but she remained firm. So the man turned to those waiting in line and made an emotional plea. He asked if they cared about the fate of a fellow person and requested them to lend him the missing amount. He urged them to think as if they were preparing for a severe judgment and consider what they would be able to tell the Almighty. Different people in line reacted in various ways. One person chose to leave the line altogether. The destitute-looking man turned to a young guy who didn't appear as needy, wondering what 10 rubles meant to him. A woman standing behind the young guy took out a coin, and the homeless man thanked her. He stated that angels wouldn't forget her, and perhaps this act of kindness would outweigh all her sins. Then, he took out 50 rubles from his pocket and handed it to the cashier. He returned the coin to the woman, placed a 10-ruble coin on the counter, and told the young guy that he would need it. The homeless man added that he would have something to remember in hell, leaving the line to continue. The young guy made the payment, and the cashier asked for change, specifically 10 rubles. The young guy handed her the 10-ruble coin left by the homeless man. After completing his purchase, he exited to an empty parking lot and resumed his phone conversation, still justifying himself about some business trip. He also mentioned a woman who made his wife jealous. As the guy walked, he spotted the man who had been sitting on the curb earlier. Approaching him, he offered a coin, feeling that the man didn't need charity. The homeless man inquired if the guy was afraid of burning in fiery Gehenna and whether he believed in the Lord. The guy confessed that he wasn't very religious. In response, the homeless man asked if the guy planned to become worm food after death, questioning if that was the pinnacle of his life. The guy, a mathematician who believed in exact sciences, inquired if there was any evidence of God's existence. The homeless man claimed that there was an undeniable fact. The guy, however, began making fun of him, suggesting that he should take a break from doing nothing. On their way back, the homeless man started crying, leaving the guy confused about what had upset him so much. In an attempt to comfort the homeless man, the guy reassured him, saying he was young and had everything ahead of him. He encouraged the homeless man to think about the future because it all depended on him. By the way, the guy mentioned earlier that he could provide evidence of God's existence. The homeless man responded with an air of calmness, stating that he had seen Jesus himself because he was the eternal Jew, the one who hadn't let the Lord rest at his house when he was carrying the cross. According to his account, he had told Jesus that he could rest on the way back, and Jesus had agreed, but it would take some time. The man asked once more, "And this happened 20 years ago?" The homeless man acknowledged that it did indeed sound peculiar. He admitted that he was amazed at first too, but with time, he had grown accustomed to it. For him, the existence of Jesus Christ was a matter of fact. However, he confessed that he couldn't offer any tangible proof. He hadn't kept any piece of clothing that Jesus wore, and how could he prove that it wasn't merely a piece of his own underwear? He didn't possess the cup from which Christ had drunk, or the stone from under his cross. The man conceded that the Jew had seen Jesus, but he inquired further. What was he like? The homeless man explained that Jesus appeared to be just like everyone else, although he seemed tormented. He also mentioned that he couldn't recall his face, whereas the man could remember all the faces he had encountered in his own life. The man, still puzzled, pressed on and asked for more details. The Jew explained that Jesus was being led past his house under guard, and he stopped to rest. However, he couldn't allow Jesus to lean on his house because, after all, Jesus called himself the Son of God, and that seemed outrageous. So he told Jesus that he could rest on the way back, and he believed it was God's command that Jesus should wait for him. At that time, he couldn't possibly have known who Jesus truly was, and no one could. The guy, still curious, asked if the Jew felt ashamed for not allowing Jesus to rest. The homeless man responded by suggesting that perhaps it was part of God's plan. The man inquired further, asking if the Jew had ever tried to make amends, perhaps becoming a clergyman. His conversation partner admitted that he had tried many times, but no divine descent had occurred, and no indulgence was granted. The man then speculated if the Jew had been something extraordinary over the years, like an immortal killer. He found the idea of an immortal killer fascinating. The Jew, however, objected, explaining that being immortal might be cool in movies, but in real life it meant searching for sustenance, seeking warmth, and waiting, much like waiting in line. He described how he had already scrutinized all the advertisements on the walls, every hole in the couch, and found that people kept coming and going. He admitted that it was no longer interesting to him, pondering over who stood where in the hierarchy, whose place was more comfortable, or who jumped the queue. The guy was still curious and inquired about what the Jew was waiting for. Was it the second coming or the end of the world? The homeless man nodded and said, "Maybe both. No one knows when the end will come." The man found himself puzzled once again, noting that even an ordinary person fears death. He wondered if the homeless man, despite being eternal, would survive if, say, one of his fingers were cut off. He questioned what would happen if a tank were to shoot him in the head. Would he become an undying, headless man? The homeless man responded with confidence, saying that such incidents wouldn't occur. The man then asked if the homeless man had ever attempted to end his life himself. The Jew nodded and admitted that he had tried, even attempting to hang himself in the very beginning. He had hung from a tree for 2 weeks with excruciating pain in his throat until the branch finally broke. Later, in 1945, he was captured by the fascists and had become terrified, attempting to shoot himself. However, the gun jammed, and when it did fire, it exploded, shredding his whole arm with shrapnel. But remarkably, everything had healed. The homeless man shared that he had come to Russia from Poland 40 years ago. The man, growing more curious, suggested that perhaps the homeless man might be schizophrenic and questioned how he had come to believe that all these events were real. In response, the homeless man displayed his arm, revealing notches with dates etched into his skin. 920, 1464, 1812. Decades passed, and he continued to sit and think. He considered that maybe he had scratched those notches just yesterday, putting the dates as if 200 years had passed. He asked for the man's help to figure it out, suggesting even stabbing him with a knife. But the man refused, unwilling to explain to the police that he had encountered Jesus and shouldn't have died. The homeless man shrugged, explaining that's how life works as they walked across the parking lot. The guy was curious and asked him to share something from history, like what was happening in the 1st century. The homeless man replied, "Well, in general it was pretty much the same. Shepherds herded sheep and fishermen fished." The guy pressed on, mentioning that in the world, the significant appearance of Jesus and the church reforms had stirred up mysteries and intrigues. Puzzled, the homeless man asked where he had learned all of this. The guy admitted he had picked it up from books. Then, he remembered where he had been in August 2000. He reflected on how, throughout the ages, he had simply lived, residing in different countries. He emphasized that all his body required was a warm place and a piece of bread. As for how his neighbors reacted to him being eternally alive and forever young, they hadn't paid much attention to it. He hadn't stayed in one place for long. When asked if he knew ancient languages, the guy responded affirmatively, but noted that they were considered dead languages today, and there were few who could verify his knowledge. Their conversation turned to the topic of space. The homeless man admitted he had seen many strange things but hadn't encountered extraterrestrials. The guy pondered a profound question. Could it truly be that, amidst the vast diversity of worlds, there were no other forms of life? He commented that such deep contemplations seemed out of place for a homeless man, possibly one who had indulged in heavy drinking. As the homeless man prepared to leave, the guy locked his car and followed him. He asked why Jesus had punished him, as Jesus was known for forgiveness. The Jew clarified that it wasn't Jesus who had punished him, but that he had cursed himself with his own words, and the Lord had merely fulfilled his own wish. The biggest curse wasn't that he had been waiting for 1,000 years, but that he had remained unchanged, like a shepherd who had failed to grow spiritually. The guy found it hard to believe, arguing that he had lived for so long, gaining knowledge and perhaps even meeting great figures like Michelangelo or Nietzsche. In response, the homeless man questioned how one could understand what these figures would say about him after death, suggesting that people might simply label him a genius. The guy probed further, asking about the thoughts and beliefs of people from 1,000 years ago. The homeless man replied that they believed the earth was flat and that God watched from the sky above the clouds. However, if God observed through their eyes, he could only judge actions to the extent that they concerned individuals. The homeless man added that if God was within everyone, so was the devil. The guy playfully teased, calling his words profound for a peculiar man. The homeless man smiled and offered insight, explaining that people always had choices, and fate was determined by those choices. People could change their choices at any moment. He questioned why, in the modern world, people were willing to kill others who didn't share their faith. He suggested that keeping opinions about others' religions to oneself required effort. People found something sacred that gave their life meaning, but then they began comparing their beliefs to assert their significance over others. Certainly, it inevitably leads to conflict. The guy's wife calls again, and he offers his apologies, explaining that he hasn't finished yet. He mentions that he's been engrossed in conversation with an intriguing person. She informs him that she's on her way. He returns to the homeless man, taking a seat beside him. The guy inquires why the homeless man remains without a home if he's so intelligent, and why he seems unwilling to make a change. The homeless man responds that he's living as if he's preparing for a significant exam, constantly postponing the transformation of his life for later. The conversational partner acknowledges that he can relate, saying he's living somewhat similarly, but doesn't want to dwell on thoughts of death since he's still quite young. The man of Jewish descent reassures him, "You won't even notice how time passes. Regardless of what one does, middle age arrives, followed by old age, and deep down, every elderly man feels like a little boy." The guy expresses his reluctance to dwell on old age and death, suggesting that people likely invented religion to create the illusion of an afterlife. He then smiles and comments on how he's clearly been deceived. His conversational partner, he points out, hasn't lived for 2,000 years, and he doesn't appear crazy. Perhaps he possesses a unique biology where cells divide more frequently, and his body consistently regenerates, attributed to special genetics. It's possible they could develop medicine from his blood. Surely he couldn't have led an unremarkable life. The Jewish man chuckles and reveals that he too is Jewish. During World War II, he was in Poland. He was hidden by a Polish family, and when they were eventually discovered, they were taken as prisoners. That's when he attempted to shoot himself, the guy laments. "Well, yes, times were tough," he adds. The homeless man disagrees. Times are always the same. His conversation partner is astonished. But how can that be? Everything in the world has changed. If you trace history from the Middle Ages to the present day, a lot has changed. The Jewish man explains, "Everything changes if you pay attention to those changes every day, just like a river that flows and rages but is never the same. However, the way that river flowed 100 years ago is the same way it flows today in the same channel." The guy becomes more animated and asks the homeless man for his thoughts on the paradox of faith, whether God can create a stone that he can't lift. The homeless man explains, "It's a paradox of the mind. If one is a scientific atheist, they'd agree that all information about the surrounding world enters the mind through the senses. The idea of God is in one's mind, so the problem is in the mind. God in your mind can't create a stone in your mind that he's about to lift in your own mind." The guy, still puzzled, questions, "But if he can't lift it, then he's not all-powerful." The homeless man offers advice, suggesting not to overthink things. His conversation partner, curious for answers, also seeks clarity. The homeless man shares his own quest for understanding, pondering life's purpose, the afterlife, and the essence of achievement. He inquires about the guy's aspirations if he were immortal. Observing the guy's contemplation, he simplifies his answer: to live and nothing more. On the first day of immortality, he'd jump for joy. The guy is perplexed about realizing immortality. He questions the purpose of human creation by a divine being, hoping for meaning. The homeless man acknowledges the possibility of a purpose, but admits he doesn't possess such knowledge. He's yet to meet anyone who has found it, even prominent figures in history like Hitler. Despite his beliefs and intentions, did Hitler truly find self-fulfillment as he sought to reshape history? He indeed spent his life embodying the caricature of a mustachioed villain, missing the spark within him that could have inspired others. The homeless man isn't sure if self-realization is achievable within our world. He ponders how one can reach heaven when there's a devil within. He explains that human emotions stem from fear, and the fear-driven part endures eternal torment, while the loving part leads to heaven. Choosing God within oneself is the path to heaven. When the guy asks if the homeless man is God, there's a laugh. He's called a homeless man and God interchangeably, emphasizing that he's a human with a touch of divinity, a bit of love. The guy wonders about God's purpose for him and can't fathom being left to live forever without meaning. The homeless man references Plato, comparing humans to horses, embodiments of the idea of a human that lives eternally. Their meeting isn't symbolic. It's like meeting the idea of a human, something he's encountered in the mirror, diverse but ultimately the same. People, unique in their own minds, are constantly replaced by new generations. The homeless man leaves with a man who has the same face, bewildering the guy. A woman who came searching for the guy believes he's mocking her for staying with a vagabond. Then, a man with the same face as the homeless man appears and scolds the guy, seeking help with bags. The homeless man departs with him, leaving the guy in confusion. The woman thinks he's gone mad and drives away. As the guy gets into his car, he gazes into the rearview mirror, and the eyes of a stranger stare back at him.